Good afternoon, and welcome to Making the Case with Dr. Akande. I'm Dr. Yemi Akande, and each week on the program, we'll bring you conversations with established and emerging leaders from a broad range of organizations as they offer their views on pressing local, national, and international issues that impact Northeast Ohio. Welcome to Making the Case with Yemi Akande. My guest today is Robert Jaquay, Associate Director of the George Gund Foundation. Bob, as he is known, has had a very stellar history in Cleveland. But what is even more so interesting about his history is he started right here from John Carroll, where he graduated with a BS in Business Administration and then went on for a JD from Cleveland State University. And you couldn't stop there, could you? You had to keep on going until you earned your MPA from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Welcome to my show, Bob.
Yemi, thanks for having me.
Great.
Glad to be at WJCU.
Exactly.
Things have changed. In my day, it was WUJC.
So they just flipped it, essentially. Times have changed, but still it is a thriving radio station. So, Bob, how did it all start for you? You've been very busy.
Well, I'm probably the typical Cleveland kid story.
Okay.
I grew up in Euclid.
Ah.
I was a student in the Cleveland Catholic schools. They
Really?
had me for 8 years at Holy Cross School, and the Marianist brothers at St. Joseph High School now merged with the Ursuline School down the road. It's called Villa Angela St. Joseph's.
Ah.
I went to John Carroll starting in 1973.
What do you remember most fondly about your experience at John Carroll?
Well, I have to admit that John Carroll has worn well on me. I've become more fond of the place as the years go by.
In what way?
I more deeply appreciate the quality of the liberal arts education that was mixed in with my business school training.
Right.
And I also deeply appreciate the deep bond that I made with a number of mates that I lived with in Burnett Hall that decades later still is strong and thriving.
Mm-hmm. Anyone that we may know?
There's a fellow named Tom Engelhart who finished in 77 who over the years has made great effort to keep all of us together and greatly assisted with email and other things like that.
Mm-hmm. Is the core of the group still in Cleveland?
Yes, quite a few.
That's
quite
great.
a few. Frank Novak, Steve Billick. I'm going to leave somebody out, so I probably better not go further down the list.
Fair enough.
I'll make somebody angry. It's a great group of guys, and with spouses, mates, kids, it's really been a wonderful thing in my life.
That's great.
I also think that there's a sense as I look back, my exposure to the philosophy of the Superior General, Father Arupe, and the sort of men and women for others concept that still really resonates in the way that I try to look at my work, my community, the way I try to live my life. So there are some things that are definitely abiding.
That's great. So you started out at John Carroll.
I did.
And after John Carroll, was there a break in between your pursuing your law degree, or you just went straight through and then came back home?
I went to the Hill for a very short time. I worked on the staff of the Ways and Means Oversight Subcommittee right after college. There was a fellow John Carroll student, Debbie Kalovich, who was also there at the same time. And I remember the day that I first met Kathy Barber. I did not meet her on campus, but I met her when she came to visit and have lunch with her student, Debbie Kalovich, and worked her way around the Hill. That same day, I guess, she had a similar meeting with Tim Russert and a group of Buffalo kids that were working for Daniel Patrick Moynihan on the other side of the Hill over at the Senate.
Wow, great crowd.
So there was quite a crowd. And then I came back to Cleveland and became active in Euclid community things. I got a position as a transportation planner at NOACA, and I also worked catch as catch can on weekends and evenings studying public administration at Cleveland State University.
Did you know that you always wanted to be working actively in what I would call the civic arena, which is that intersecting point of government, nonprofit, for-profit?
I think there was always this sense of direction, but there was a lot of groping along as I went.
When you say sense of direction, was that something that you would say was instilled by you by mentors or people you encounter?
That's a great question. I once had a lunch with a fellow named Paul Brophy, who also was a Jesuit product from the Pittsburgh area. And he and I agreed on a definition. We both got involved in civic life, community development, and similar activities with our career because we grew up in neighborhoods that worked for us. In my case, my mother died when I was a little boy, and my father was very attentive, kept his job, was home every night, spent time with my sister and I on weekends. But I also noticed that there were a lot of other people looking out for me and my sister and my dad, neighbors and folks at church and at the school, the ladies that kept the stores and the fellow that was behind the counter at the butcher store. A lot of people knew who I was and were always looking out for me to make sure that I got correction and guidance and all the stuff that we needed to get along. It was an interesting phenomenon. And so I think my life has been, in some quiet way, just trying to help others have the same kind of supports and the same kind of nurturing places that work for them too.
So how did you go from there to Harvard MPA? You kept on in your education, wanting to learn more.
Well, my career path from the time of grad school and my work as a planner at NOACA ended a few years later when I went and enrolled at Cleveland Marshall as a full-time law student. The full-time status only lasted through my first year. And the next summer I began to do this sort of catch-as-catch-can routine again, where I worked, clerked, went to law school, and finished up in 3 years' time, but tried to get a number of experiences. I worked at Central National Bank working on Community Reinvestment Act compliance and other ways that the bank would reach out to neighborhoods in Cleveland. I became very active with a number of local political leaders and officials. There's a fellow who was very much involved in the John Carroll University that was a great mentor of mine in that era. Joe Farrell was the dean of students on campus for many years. I think he held the post twice in his life. He left when Dick McNally came in and taught at St. Joseph High School, where I was a student years before, and then came back to campus probably maybe 10 years after I left, and spent the rest of his career until he died a number of years ago. Tragically, a young man in his 50s. But while Joe was still living, he was very much engaged in his community and allowed me to tag along with him, watching and learning as he was serving people in the community as a city councilman and trying to deal with some complex social issues of racial integration and trying to keep a first-ring suburb fiscally on even keel.
So you had some great mentors.
A long string of them.
Yeah. Who are some others that you would say were pivotal to who you've become today and also your career?
As I think about the long string, there are some people that do stand out. When I was a young boy, probably 7 or 8 years old, there were kids that were allowed to stay out of their sort of blue-topped, dark black-tied uniform from Holy Cross School if they wore their Cub Scout uniforms to class. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. Sharp uniforms. I'd like to be one of those fellows. But my mother had passed away just about a year before I became age for Cub Scouts. And there was a lady in my neighborhood that knew of my situation that stepped up and said, my boys are in the same group with Bob, and I think that, I like this den mother routine, and so when his turn comes up, I'll be his den mother too. And her name is Helen Bensick, and that lady probably was one of the earliest and most direct role models for me in a mode of public service. She stepped up and served others, and it was a pretty modest thing, I suppose, in hindsight. Having a few more kids in the basement on Tuesday afternoons between 3 and 5 wasn't all that big a deal to her, perhaps, but to me it changed my life. It was really a seminal moment. There were high school teachers. Another John Carroll product, Joseph Radican, was a history teacher and the principal of my school. He spent a lot of time with me and others talking about good government and possible career paths as public servants. Made sure that our service on student council and other committees were appropriate and well guided. I mentioned Joe Farrell, who was so active in local politics and took me under his wing in that way. Later, a number of years later, after I had been practicing law for a number of years, I finally met Kathy Barber in a professional circumstance. She was the chair of a committee appointed by the county commissioners after the SAFE financial crisis. And I became the staff director working under Kathy's guidance with a committee of 6 other appointees by the county commissioners. And together we wrote something called the Blueprint for County Government Reform, which predated the passage of the Cuyahoga County Charter by about 15 years. But when it came time to deal with needed reform, with all of the indictments and the coming to light of corruption of public officials, that report was dusted off and consulted and substantially followed in the charter that was recommended and finally passed. Kathy was a great role model. She was obviously very scholarly and very thorough and a great political leader in that she was able to listen to all sides and was very, very encouraging of my work, for which I'll always be grateful.
So some people may say that you were definitely a futurist in co-writing or co-authoring the blueprint for what is now part of the Cuyahoga County reform or transformation.
For a long time, Kathy and I were very unsure as to whether that report would ever go anywhere. In fact, a few years after our committee had packed up and finished our work and we had sent off all of our documents to public libraries throughout the region, we occasionally gave a speech, how big a crisis is needed to reform county government.
And here you are.
And here today the charter is now enacted. And
how does that make you feel? Knowing that you helped lay the groundwork, you did the research, you recognized that beforehand.
I think that there is a sense of satisfaction that patience and good work may take a long time to pay off, but things build on one another, and sometimes seeds that are planted today take a long time to come up.
Well, let's talk about some other major projects that you've worked on, and that is Voices and Choices.
Well, for the last 15 years, I've been at the George Gund Foundation. My role as associate director in kind of a 2-part job description. I spend a substantial portion of my time on administrative and financial matters. I work directly under Dave Abbott, our executive director. Another substantial part of my work involves directing our foundation's grant making in this sphere of economic and community development. In that portion of my work life, I've been active in our foundation's support of an organization called the Fund for Our Economic Future. It started out in a very informal way where a couple of program officers going to the same meetings realized we probably had the kernel of a conversation if we just started to share perspectives and what we call docket sheets, the list of proposals that are coming to our foundation at any given period of time, and talk about the proposals we have in common or proposals that are in the same subject area but we're not getting in common, just to get a sense of the demand in its fullest that plays out throughout the region. After doing that for a couple of quarters, somebody had the great idea of saying, we should just all pool our money and have a fund and collectively decide how to distribute. We'll get a more coherent strategy that way. And that idea was really the germination of the Fund for Economic Future, which has grown into we've been at it probably 7 or 8 years, and we've probably put out or have committed up to maybe $75-80 million at this point, and a lot of other sidecar investments that our institutions have made individually, or not just grants but potential investments. We've done a lot of mission-related investments. A number of endowed institutions collectively are doing funds of funds that would help to finance emerging pipelines of business ideas that have the possibility of substantial growth. The Fund for Economic Future at its outset thought it was very important, in addition to making grants, to do 2 other component pieces of work. One is to engage the best local minds on research and the status of our economy, how to measure it, how to get its sense of trajectory. And that piece of work has as its flagship something called the Dashboard of Economic Indicators. And there were a group of folks that were engaged by the fund, including a John Carroll graduate, Jack Kleinhens. I have had the good fortune of working with Jack and an economist, Randy Eberts, and another George Erichek. Both of those fellows are from the Upjohn Institute. And they created a very complex set of models and exercises, but at the end of all of the computations and statistical analysis have come up with some really clear lessons on what most matters in terms of civic, public-private interventions in the regional economy to make best effect in changing trajectory. A couple of those lessons seem pretty obvious or intuitive. By collectively investing in the infrastructure that nurtures entrepreneurship and capital formation, and putting good ideas that not only have scientific validity but commercialization prospect, instead of sending them out into the world by license and allowing them to be produced anywhere, try to create firms in this place to take those ideas to market, to scale, and hopefully eventually becoming the fuel for employment and increasing tax base. The other is a very important lesson that those regions of the country that have higher college attainment rates and portions of the population that have not only achieved baccalaureate but graduate school status tend to fare much better economically than those places with lower attainment rates. And so ideas of universities and the pipelines of the educated students that they create and put into a place like Cleveland are really, really important for our long-term economic success. We've also learned that, statistically speaking, the notions of diversity and opportunity for all are not just the right thing to do, not just morally the thing to do, but are economically the thing to do. That places that are conscious and successful in creating opportunities for all sorts of individuals in a place fare better economically. Hinted, but not quite as starkly from the Dashboard of Economic Indicators, a fourth lesson that we've carried forward at the fund is one that we've really derived from your reference to Voices and Choices, this huge public outreach effort, which was structured to try to engage individual citizens and thought leaders and all sorts of sectors of our community, the business community, public officials, university presidents, hospital leaders, other places where ideas that might have commercial viability are generated, financial institution leaders, in a way to think about what most matters. And in that civic engagement exercise called Voices and Choices, out of the thousands and thousands of people that were engaged in that process, the number one lesson that came back in all of the feedback is that efforts to improve the efficiency and collaboration among local government entities was deemed to be the most directly related to changing our economic fortune in the minds of most individuals.
And is that accurate?
Well, statistically, there's some evidence for that in the modeling, but we also realize that there's probably some wisdom in listening to the crowd. And so we've tried to incorporate that type of work in our collective action for the Fund for Our Economic Future. We try to, with our grant making, with our research, with our other convening activities and ability to try to get out the message, I found that encouraging entrepreneurship, business formation, the idea of trying to incent minority inclusion in business opportunities, the effort to look at how to upgrade the talent and the skill sets of our population so that we can more readily engage in new job opportunities and growth scenarios here in Northeast Ohio. And then lastly, ways for our local governments to collaborate and work more efficiently are the four sorts of swaths of work that we've been engaged collectively together over the last 6-7 years. We've been together about 8. It took us a couple of years to really get grounded in the general activity that we have. A number of the grantees of the foundation are well known throughout the region. Jumpstart Bioenterprise, Team Neo, Nortec, Magnet, the Minority Business Accelerator. There are a number of really high-quality, high-functioning nonprofits that nurture private entrepreneurs and private investment and the creation of firms that ultimately will lead to greater employment, greater economic vitality in this region.
So essentially, it is still a living document that you go back to and continue to mine for data, or even continue to mine from a futurist perspective as to what needs to be pursued.
One of the technical challenges we think we face is that the construct of what data we examine and how various data points come together statistically to create factors against which we can measure the output of our economy, whether it's per capita income change, the productivity of our firms, the employment level changes, the gross regional product. We're thinking that post-recession we probably have to rerun the factor analysis to see what lessons that exercise tells us about the post-recession economy that we're dealing with, to see if we have to tweak or even dramatically recalibrate the kind of interventions that we're funding and trying to get others to participate in around the region.
What are some of the early lessons that you would say you have learned? And when I say you, I don't mean you solely, but collectively learned from the Voices and Choices document.
Well, I think that there is a great respect that the funding community has for the wisdom of the crowd. We realize that we can't work in isolation, and that aside from the collective voice of the crowd, we also have to try to very carefully listen and cultivate to a lot of communities that are within the whole.
How difficult is that?
It is one that has to be constantly refreshed. It takes a lot of effort and time. It's not only a matter of listening and acting, but it's building up of trust and getting to know individuals and institutions to institutions, developing relationships that may not exist or may have histories that are not always collaborative in nature. We, as I look back on the 6-7 years of the fund, there are a number of things that collectively we've done together that just could not have happened if we worked individually.
Such as?
Well, my litany includes the fact that the philanthropic community probably increased by 4 or 5-fold the amount of money that we put on the table for regional economic development than we would have if we continued to act alone. Collectively, we've put more on the table. So there's been a big leveraging factor. I also think that as we look at the grants that we've made and the work of creating a pipeline, the basic culture of our mature industrial community has changed. In some ways, we've gone back to the future in that firm formation and championing the entrepreneur as a way of changing our economic direction is occurring in this community today in a way that it hasn't for a century or more.
So we're making progress.
If you hearken back to the era of the early 1900s and the late 1800s, you see this kind of firm formation and venture capital fueling ideas being brought to market. And that's the same kind of environment we're trying to recreate, but in today's context, in today's globally competitive environment. We also have, I think, helped significantly as institutional investors to aggregate capital that has helped to revive a moribund venture capital market, which is a very, very significant change to the landscape. I also think we've revived the art of regional economic analysis that for many years before was practiced at the Federal Reserve Bank and some of the academic institutions, but had seemed to gone out of favor and was not fashionable. But now there's a very robust and revived community of practitioners. I've mentioned a number of them, including John Carroll's Jack Kleinhans, but many institutions are involved, including Tom Zlatiper, the former dean of the Bowler School, who's still active in our circles. So I think the overall lesson, aside from looking at some of the specific gains that we've made together, is the fundamental notion that our collective impact and our collaboration has made a much more significant difference than if we'd continued to act alone and individually as institutions. Philanthropic institutions, by their nature, are very independent beasts, and the prerogatives of a donor are jealously guarded. And in many instances, that's a very good thing. It's inherently good. But at the same time, if there is a way to practice how to subordinate those prerogatives from time to time for a broader collective good, then significant things can happen, and I think they have here.
Indeed. What would you say is the relationship of the foundations in town to the mayor's office, or even to driving the civic agenda? Do you perceive the role of foundations as working collaboratively with the mayor's office, for example, in driving the civic agenda, or do they help set the agenda?
Well, I think that it is very, very important for the philanthropic community to maintain channels of communication with lots of civic leadership, not the least of which, and arguably some of the most important, are those in chief elected officials' positions. I know that from issue to issue, our foundation is in very frequent contact with the office of the mayor and other city officials relevant to whatever kind of issue that we're facing from time to time. For example, right now there is a great deal of interaction and discussion over the Cleveland Municipal School District and the effort to find the right replacement for Dr. Sanders and to see some of the gains in the transformation plans for the school district continue and succeed ultimately. And so the communication between various folks at the Gun Foundation and Mayor Jackson and people on his staff are ongoing and regular.
Mm. You talked a little bit earlier about this issue of trust.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that? What does trust mean within the civic realm? How easy is it to gain it, and how easy is it to lose it?
That's a great question. In a general sense, there has to be an understanding of how one can keep confidences if needed, mm-hmm. how one can be predictable in their actions, how, if agreements are made, are carried out without deviation unless there's communication about needs to change course. Mm-hmm. I often, the phrase "no surprises" comes to mind when we think about how to build trust. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I think can't always be stored up. Mm. One has to continue to work at it and
you can't build a reservoir of trust.
Continue to prove worthy. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think that if one, as an individual or an institution over the course of time, is considered to be honest and generally trustworthy, then occasional mistakes or foibles can be considered a deviation and not necessarily an ongoing character flaw. Mm-hmm. But allows people then, with mistakes, to communicate and work through them, deal with emotions that might be raw, might be pitched at a particular point in time, and get through them to continue on in a positive manner. This very complicated stuff of human relations.
Indeed.
It happens between friends and between spouses and parents and children and
colleagues
neighbors
too.
and
right.
colleagues.
Business leaders
absolutely.
And what have you. Yeah,
absolutely.
That is true. So let's talk a little bit about what you would be doing if you weren't here.
It's a good question. I haven't given it much thought. I'm too busy, actively engaged in exactly what I'm doing at the moment.
So you are living your passion?
I think that I'm pretty close to being actualized, yes.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
There was this great article years ago that I took to heart. I think I was a young lawyer at the time. Some people in the John Carroll audience might know of Donald Cousins, who for years has been affiliated with Borromeo. Exactly
yes.
right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he once wrote a column, an op-ed in the Plain Dealer that I clipped out and I put into a reading book that I keep. And the gist of the article started out that he was worried about the culture where people had to be the best, they had to win awards, they had to somehow get outside affirmation. He said the secret to being a successful person isn't winning a Nobel Prize or getting a degree from an Ivy League institution or being elected to some high office. It's living authentically, to having a sense of oneself and how one fit with others, and to stay grounded and to live authentically, genuinely as one feels they should be.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And this career path feels like the authentic me. It sort of connects my heart and my gut to my head. It all seems to fit. And some days are harder than others, and it is occasionally very hard work. And sometimes it does, one spends quite a bit of emotion and energy. Mm-hmm. But it feels right for me. I'm very, very fortunate in that regard. It's not just work, it's a vocation, I think.
That is so true. I think I didn't attend John Carroll, but I taught there for 4 years, and people often ask me, so which one of the Jesuit institutions did you graduate from? I said, well, I graduated by osmosis. Wasn't quite there, but I do believe in men and women for others, for the greater good. Let's talk a little bit about some of your external activities, which include the fact that you're a member of the National Book Critics Circle. But what I want you to address is, let's say, for example, you just weren't just a member, but you had written a 5-chapter book on Cleveland. What would the title of that book be? And what would those 5 chapters possibly comprise of?
Wow. Well, you know, I have played around in my head the notion of sort of the double entendre of a Cleveland reader. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that the book would be about things written by or about Cleveland and about how it affects the thinking and the work and the living of this Cleveland reader. The notion of a reader as an anthology, but the reader as an individual that engages the written word all at the same time. Mm-hmm. I was very fortunate. When I was a little boy, I used to go with my grandmother from my home in Euclid on the RTA to her home in Lakewood, and the 39 would let us off right in front of the Cleveland Public Library, and we would duck down on the time that we had on the transfer to get over to the Cordoba bus that would take us over to Lakewood, to go into the newspaper reading room, or to go up into the reading room with all the big long mahogany desks and desk lamps and the stacks of books that one could wander through. Mm-hmm. And I think that the sense of awe for reading, I think, really got set at that point. In that same era, I was stretching to pull the Cleveland Plain Dealer out of the milk chute and try to get a jump on my dad, who probably knew all the news that were the headlines anyhow, particularly whether the Indians won or lost the night before. But somehow I struggled to read before the phonics lesson so that I could tell him the headlines and become his own headline service at the breakfast table. Mm-hmm. And that led to Story Hour, and that led to just this appreciation for reading. It's interesting. There was this one seminal moment. How did you get this question? In my life, I remember clearly that despite all of the solid, healthy remonstrances by librarians and teachers that reading opened up an entire world, I discovered at one era when I realized that I could learn more about not just the world, but my place by being a reader. There were a stack of books that were not really for distribution outside of the library, but could be consulted by people who sat at the tables and brought the books back to a librarian once they pulled them off the shelves. And there was an interest in one of my buddies when I was in about 6th or 7th grade. Was the son of a Euclid policeman. Mm-hmm. And my buddy was anxious to see the manuals that his father and some of the other policemen were studying to take the next civil service test for some advancement in rank. And they were there on the shelves. But right next to them one day was this big, thick book. It said Cleveland History. Mm. And I remember it was by this fellow named William Ganson Rose. And I said, this looks interesting. There's a picture of the Terminal Tower on it in downtown Cleveland. Let's go see what this is about. So I pulled it off the shelves, went over to the desk. And in the back of the book, there was this little entry about Euclid. And I said, this is my town. Right. I'm sitting in the middle of Euclid reading about Euclid. This is cool. And from that moment, I realized that there was a lot of reading to be done about this place. So I suppose if I had 5 chapters, oh my goodness, you're going to be sorry you asked this question. I could take up like 2 hours with this one.
It's fine, we got the tape.
But there was this amazing notion about the lake and all sorts of things that have been written about the lake. Poems and narrative accounts of Oliver Hazard Perry and the Battle of Lake Erie and the War of 1812. Connecting that up to the statue that's over by Huntington Park next to the old courthouse. There's this one wonderful short story, and I'm blanking on the name of the author, who was really popular. Came from Cleveland, grew up in Lakewood, and wrote short stories and screenplays in Los Angeles for years. But I think the story is called Susanna at the Beach, and it's this short story about this young woman diving off rocks at Edgewater Park. There's a great story that's in American Notes that tells of Dickens' tale coming to America, and he writes about somehow picking up somewhere around Sandusky a copy of The Plain Dealer and just being aggravated by its sort of jingoistic anti-British stances being espoused in the Plain Dealer, and he was so angry about the newspaper. He didn't want to meet the mayor when the mayor came to visit him when his ship moored in Cleveland, but afterwards with another friend from the boat took a walk around the town and thought it was a pretty little town nonetheless. But just all these amazing stories about the glaciers and Paul Bunyan and, Babe the Blue Ox, and how in their trek from the northeast to Minnesota, where he became really famous, Babe got thirsty on the way, so that, Paul Bunyan had to dig the Great Lakes. I mean, there are all these amazing stories that are about the lake that need to be sort of reappreciated and told. There's a whole theme about, Cleveland as an industrial place, a melting pot in so many ways, a stew maybe more than a melting pot. A lot of Don Robertson stories that talk about Cleveland in the 40s and the 50s, the greatest things since sliced bread. And there was one anthologist from Case that actually reprinted a story about the East Ohio gas fire and how the character in the novel, Morris Bird III, acted so heroically with his sister and the neighbor that he pulled to safety and took them up on this crazy red wagon that he carted around the neighborhood. There's a wonderful story from I think it's called The Deep Blue Sea. Langston Hughes has an autobiography with Cleveland chapters, and he talks about his time at Central High. And he recounts a poem that he wrote about his stepfather working in the mills. And he recounts the great mix of kids of all backgrounds from that era. I have a friend, Tom Andrzejewski, wrote for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Occasionally see him on the rap at home, and I inquired about whether the Andrzejewski that Langston Hughes mentions as his school buddy was any relative. He said probably, but he couldn't pinpoint it. Anyhow, I could go on for hours on this topic because there is so much that has been written about this community.
What would make your book different?
I think that trying to contextualize these readings in my understanding of place and how it's helped me understand on deeper levels the nature of this place, the people within it, challenges we face, victories we've achieved, defeats we've suffered. It somehow deepens my passion for the place and for the work at hand. I find comfort and motivation and deeper understanding, which is so valuable.
You've highlighted definitely some former Clevelanders as well as current Clevelanders that would find their way into this book. If you had to write short biographies of individuals that you have either read about, come across, who would you include as part of those
that's
biographies?
Another great question. It could go one of two ways. I could easily see writing about individuals who came across my paths around this string of mentors. Starting from Helen Bensick, the noble den mother who stood up for me when I was a kid, and Joe Radican, the school principal who dealt with knotty issues of, a Chalta strike, and during the era of the Reed versus Rhodes and the bishop's admonition about how to, comport with social doctrine, Catholic social teachings, in the midst of the segregation order and all these complex things that I watched him deal with as he tried to lead our school. I could talk about politicians like Joe Farrell and another friend, Bill Mabel, who was one of Joe's fellows on the Cleveland City Council, or Euclid City Council, rather, who also was a real heroic figure in my life. I learned a lot from him and left an imprint on me that I think will last forever. There's a demographer whose life work I've long admired, a guy named Tom Beyer, who for many years was affiliated with Cleveland State's College of Urban Affairs. There have been political leaders. I thought George Voinovich would make an interesting 5-minute biography. Obviously, he's gotten a lot of share of press, but I don't know of anyone that's written a book about him yet. I'm sure someone will eventually. I find a lot of people that I've met in my public life, like Kathy Barber that I've mentioned earlier, would certainly fit on that roster. There's this long chain of individuals that I could put in here for what kind of observations I've learned from them about life or the work that I've chosen to do, about ways that I view community. The other notion is to try to sort of profile people that seemingly have made an era. There are a lot of people just below the radar screen.
Such as?
Well, when I was working at City Hall and Voinovich was working to bring the city out of default, there were people like Gary Conley and Hunter Morrison. Conley was the director of economic development and Morrison was the planning director, and together they conspired to take this planning exercise known as civic vision and elevate it to an exercise that required a lot of the groups within Cleveland to, in a sense, come to the realization of what they wanted out of the civic agenda and articulate it for others. And then listen to and share their perspectives amongst other portions of the community as a whole. So you'd get a group of downtown business stakeholders, you'd get industrialists, you'd get the banking community, you'd get East Side ministerial associations, you'd get neighborhood groups, you'd get labor unions, you'd get a whole host of folks that make up Cleveland that would have to stand and share and articulate their perspective in an honest and open way, and then have some give and take, but from the exercise come up with some big shared understandings about what had to happen in the community for our collective movement forward. That civic vision lasted probably 20, 25 years.
Wow.
I did write a Kennedy School case study on the civic vision process, but I do think a biography of both of those fellows in this sort of concise fashion you propose would be the kind of group that I would add that were just below the radar screen. In an era just before that, when Norm Krumholtz was very famous for instilling equity planning. Well, we could go on for, lots and lots of, examples of folks just below the radar screen that would make very, very interesting stories.
I think you might have a book in you.
I don't know. We'll see.
So what's your legacy?
I like to think of not necessarily legacy, but a set of contributions.
Okay.
They may not be mine alone, but that I've helped to bring about. I don't think there's anything like as profound as, say, Thomas Jefferson's, founder of University of Virginia, author of the Declaration of Independence. I think it was the clauses of religious freedom in the colony of Virginia. I forget exactly how that was phrased, but there are these three massive world-moving events. But I hope that someday I am remembered for a contributor of ideas and not just about things that I've worked on. When I was working as a planner at the County Planning Commission in the early 1990s, I came up with this phrase called regional dynamics.
What does that mean?
It is a template that takes a lot of movements of people, of investments, over and depicts them spatially over a map, so one can see how an intervention of a big investment, or the shift of a physical plant, or the building of an interchange on the highway system shifts over time the movement of people, of investment, of economic activity, of tax base, of social problems or environmental issues that play out over a landscape. It really was a notion of taking a look at the map of this place, not just neighborhoods and downtown of Cleveland, or the first suburbs or of Cuyahoga County, but looking at the whole region. That is the appropriate take on how the economy and how our commutes and our moving patterns between home and work and home and shopping and home and church and all the other things that we do play out over the landscape of Northeast Ohio, and how goods and services move in and through this place, and how air and potentially pollution, or water and potentially pollution move through the place.
Right.
Just the ebb and the flow of daily life, of commerce, as it plays out, not just on a daily basis, but from year to year, from decade to decade, from 50-year swath to 50-year swath, so that we can visually depict and begin to think about the implications of decisions that play out in a spatial way over time, over this thing that we call community. It really was an idea that was greatly advanced with computer technology and the ability to use geographic information systems. But before then was kind of a novel idea, because it took a lot of time to get the right base map and correctly depict the phenomenon or the population status or whatever you were trying to depict in a spatial manner. But had an impact in public policy thinking in this place, at least in some circles that seem to have some currency. I'm hopeful that the work that I did with Kathy Barber on the blueprint is viewed as a contribution of a substantial sort. Very proud of that, and I like to think that in our way we helped move things along for the good in this place and how it's governed. I'm hopeful that this dashboard of economic indicators and the idea of collaboration that we're exhibiting in the Fund for Economic Future are ideas that will be templates for how we behave and how we measure this place over a long period of time. I'm hopeful people remember the ideas and not necessarily things that I've been involved with. I don't even particularly care if they remember me being involved with them, if they remember the ideas.
The impact of a great leader is having done your work, having done it well, but without people even realizing that it was you that did it. It was community-led.
Somebody I should do a 5-minute biography is Vince Lombardi, who said, if you don't care who gets the credit, you get lots done. Lots done. You get lots done.
That is indeed true. Well, it seems as though that's all the time we have for today on Making the Case with Yemi Akande. I want to thank our guest, Bob Jaquay, the Associate Director of George Gunn Foundation, for joining me today. Thank you, Bob.
Amy, it's a great pleasure. I'm honored that you asked me to be on your show.
How could I not? You're an architect of ideas.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, if you have questions or comments about today's program, please email them to mtc88.7@gmail.com. Making the Case with Dr. Akande is produced with the support of WJCU in University Heights, Ohio. Our theme music is by Alexander May, and our associate producer is Greg Priddy. I'm your host and executive producer, Dr. Yemi Akande, inviting you to tune in next week at the same time for another edition of Making the Case.